All right, yes, Wendy, thank you for that. It is time now for our keynote speaker. I've heard this expert speak quite a few times. His knowledge and presentation is fantastic. I was so excited to see that you're going to be here again. For over 20 years, this gentleman has worked as an economist at many organizations, including Canadian Pacific Railway, the Canada West Foundation, and of course the Bank of Canada. For almost a decade, he taught economics at the University of Calgary and has released 3 books in the past 5 years. Busy guy. He provides an economic commentary for many Canadian media outlets. I know he works with Global Edmonton as well, and currently serves on the University of Calgary Board of Governors and is their chair of the Calgary Arts Academy. Will you please welcome Mr. Todd Hirsch, Chief Economist of ATB Financial, for a wonderful 60-minute presentation. Nice to see you again. I'm so excited.
Well, good morning, and thank you for that very kind invitation, introduction. I guess I should get my words right here. And thank you for the kind invitation, inviting me back to BILD Alberta's conference. It's always, I never need a good excuse to come up to Jasper, but it's always wonderful reconnecting with a lot of you. And I'm always honored anytime I'm invited to speak, but to be invited back a few years now in a row is a real honor. So thank you for that, and it's an honor to be with you here this morning. The title of my presentation, as you can see, Alberta's Economic Recovery, Reality or Illusion? Now I'm going to start with a quote that people of my vintage, or maybe a little older, see if you can guess what quote this is. Is this the real life? Is this just fantasy? Oh, there's laughing already. Caught in a landslide, no escape from reality. The 30-year-olds are thinking, I have no idea what you're talking about, but that is, of course, Freddie Mercury and the band Queen from 1975's Bohemian Rhapsody. But I think Freddie sort of encapsulates what I want to talk about this morning, and that is trying to figure out, is this reality or is this an illusion when we talk about Alberta's economic recovery? Because throughout 2017, economists like myself and others and different people have been talking about it's a recovery year for Alberta and for our economy. Coming out of 2 years of recession, this is the recovery we've been waiting for. Now, naturally, I am a glass half full kind of person. I am an optimist by nature, but I always have to guard that optimism to make sure that I'm not seeing something that in fact isn't there. And that's, as an economist, that's my job, to really dig down deep into the numbers and try to figure out precisely what is going on. Another quote I like here, what the eyes see and the ears hear, the mind believes, Harry Houdini. So it's easy for natural optimists like me to perhaps look at a few select indicators and say, well, this is evidence that the economy is rebounding. It's a recovery, isn't it? So we have to be very careful, and that's my job this morning. I like this picture here. What do you see? Some people might see 2 water coolers, one of them kind of draped in some plastic. You see 2 water coolers, or if you use your imagination, it kind of looks like they're getting married, right? Kind of a bride and a groom there, if you look at it. So it's just a reminder of sometimes what we see and what we want to see or what we want to believe can lead us to wrong conclusions. So I want to walk through a few segments or a few sectors of Alberta's economy, try to decipher what's going on. Is this a recovery or is it something else a little bit different? And then at the end, I'll conclude with our current forecast for Alberta's economy, my team at ATB Financial. So let's start first of all with the energy sector. You always have to talk about the price of oil if you want to talk about this province, since in fact the drop in oil price in 2014, this was the single economic factor that changed, that threw Alberta flat on its back for 2 consecutive years, the fact that oil went from $107 down to $27 a barrel. And here, of course, we are using that US dollar benchmark price, the West Texas Intermediate, understanding, of course, that our producers receive a discounted price, the Western Canadian price. But that WTI price, after bottoming out at the beginning of 2016, around $27, $28, has now recovered modestly and has been hovering between $45 and $50 pretty consistently in that band for the last 5 months or so. And it's actually a bit unusual to see oil prices that stable in that narrow a band. And I think what this is telling us is that markets have found sort of a new equilibrium home that they're comfortable with with crude oil. The supply and demand, of course, globally are always going to dictate what the price is. And when prices get batted up to $107 a barrel and then they come crashing down to 27, to me, those are markets that are not in equilibrium or are not in balance. But now that we've seen some stability between 45 and 50, I think it's pretty compelling evidence that, in fact, that is a new sort of natural home, at least for the time being, for crude oil. We were a little above $50 yesterday, but now a little below it. But I think we can anticipate continuing being between that $45 and $50 range. The challenge with prices getting above 50, to 55 or 60, it's not so much that global demand is poor, it's on the supply side. It's all that U.S. shale oil. In fact, the hurricanes that beat down on Houston and Louisiana in the last few weeks, and now that they're getting back up on stream and demanding oil again, those refineries, this is why we've seen oil pop up above 50. But I think that's sort of a temporary factor. I think between 45 and 50 is where we can anticipate it, at least for the time being. Now that is good news and bad news for Alberta's oil producers. The good news is $47 oil is much better than $27 oil. The challenging news is that anything below 50 is kind of a challenge, or it's a $50 oil that's sort of the consensus as the break-even point for the industry in Alberta. It's not to say for every single company, $50 WTI is a break-even, but for the industry overall, $50 is sort of viewed as the break-even point. While we're a little bit below that, we're not comfortably above. So 2017, 2018 is going to continue to be a tough year for those oil producers as they try to keep their costs down. Now, how have they been doing that? Well, they've actually been doing a pretty good job of getting their costs down by eliminating headcount. So in 2015 and 2016, we saw a lot of layoffs in the energy patch. It was very sad, of course, for thousands of people who lost their jobs. But we see now in the last 12 months, a lot of those jobs in oil and gas have started to come back. In fact, in the last 12 months, the energy sector, believe it or not, has been the #1 sector of hiring in Alberta. We're starting to see some jobs coming back, about 17,000 new jobs in the last 12 months alone. The difference is this time, they're hiring back, but average pay is down about 10% from where it was before the recession. So the energy companies realized, well, we might have laid off, in fact, a few too many people when oil was at $27. Our drilling is picking up a little bit, especially on the western side of the province. We might need to hire back a few more people, but we're really going to keep our costs contained. We're going to pay them less, or we're going to hire lower cost employees. We're going to curtail overtime and overall compensation because they're forced to make $47 oil work, not $107. So actually, I think this is a good development because it shows that the energy sector has been able to operate in a new environment where 47 is probably the new normal. It is, of course, difficult for still the thousands of workers in the oil and gas sector who have not seen their jobs come back or have taken a job back in the energy patch that is paying about 10% less. Difficult for those. On the bright side, for sectors outside of oil and gas, this is really positive. Maybe some of you in the construction industry and home building industry see this, because everyone knows when oil's at $107 a barrel, it's really tough for sectors outside of the energy patch to attract and retain workers and be competitive on the salary side. Now that wages are coming down, quite sharply in fact in the energy sector, it'll be a little easier for sectors outside of oil and gas to compete. So this is how I would describe, before the downturn, I would describe the oil patch as this. It was the engine of Alberta's economy. It was powering everything ahead. Employment, wages, construction activity, home building, international capital coming in and investment coming in. Now, in 2017, I would describe it as this. It's the backbone. Now, a backbone is also very important. Try walking around anywhere without a backbone. So you need a strong backbone, but a backbone is different than an engine. A backbone doesn't power things forward. A backbone keeps everything stable and keeps everything consistent. I think that is that's how I would describe the oil patch in 2017. A backbone, things have stabilized, but we're not seeing a lot of growth coming out of the oil patch. And that will have implications for Alberta's growth in the future, which I'll get to at the end of the presentation. All right. I want to turn to another sector of Alberta's economy, and that is retail. Because retail, along with housing and personal services, but retail gives a really good indicator of consumer confidence and consumer optimism. Now, you know from my presentation style, I don't like to use a lot of charts and graphs. In fact, I hate using them. But every once in a while, I have to use one because in this case, I think it actually illustrates very nicely precisely what's gone on. So I'm going to use one chart here. And there it is, Alberta retail sales over the last 6 years. So that's June 2011 to the most recent numbers we have is June 2017. Now, between June 2011 and October of 2014, where it kind of reached a little peak there, you see this very steady and very consistent gain in retail sales over those 3.5 years. Those are the boom years. Everything was going very nicely for retailers. It was being fueled by a little bit of inflation in there, but population growth, but also consumers were feeling very confident and they were out spending money. Then by October of 2014, you started to see the impact of the recession. You started to see consumers pulling back very sharply, and you see a big drop. And by the way, I do want to point out quickly, the scale there, I think it's always important to point this out if I'm using a scale that doesn't start at 0. I started it at $4 billion a month just so that it shows the trend a little bit clearer. So I don't want to mislead anyone. But you see that big drop in November of 2014, and then it kind of trails down even lower, reaching a low point in July of 2016. That was the very lowest. But then between last summer and June of this year, the last 12 months that we have numbers for, you start to see retail sales coming back. And in fact, by May and then June again of this year, May and June, we have now surpassed that all-time record that was set back in October of 14. So we're at a new record high of retail activity in Alberta. On the surface, one might conclude, well, this is really good evidence that Alberta has recovered, that we're back in the groove and that Albertans are spending again and the good times are here. We're at a record level. What other evidence do you want? Now, I don't want to downplay the good news that we are back at a record level, but that's not really, I don't think, the best way to look at it. Consider this. Had we not experienced a recession at all, and had retail sales continued to climb along that path like they did in other Canadian provinces, that's probably where we would have been, and that's probably where a lot of retailers had anticipated they would have been. Having made investments in new capital and machinery and hiring back in 2013 and 2014, anticipating that sales are going to increase. Of course they didn't. And we have no way of telling for sure if that's where we would have ended up. It is a conjecture. But that area in between, this is where I'm going to geek out as an economist a little bit. Economists love shaded triangles and the area between two lines. But that area in between was worth about $39 billion in sort of foregone retail sales. I don't want to quite say lost retail sales because we don't know for sure that they were lost. It's just they had anticipated probably something a lot bigger. Now, $39 billion, just for some sense of relative sense of that, in an average year, Alberta retailers, they ring in about $80 billion in 1 year. So to lose $39 billion collectively is roughly half a year of lost sales in a 3-year period. That's pretty significant. So you can forgive those retailers if they're not feeling all that jolly at the moment, even though they're truly at a new record high. They probably feel we've got a long way to go to catch up to where we thought we were going to be. And probably even worse for retailers is that while their revenues might be back at a record high, their expenses have continued to climb along that blue line. Everything from labor costs to insurance costs and heating, electricity costs, all the things that go on the expense side of the ledger for a retailer, they did not come down during the recession. In fact, they continued to climb. That has left margins for many retailers just shockingly thin. And again, probably the reason why retailers aren't feeling all that joyful. Even though most of them that I talk to, they do say, yeah, sales are coming back. It's better than it was last year, but it's still a tough environment. And then the last thing that I want to touch on is, of course, the housing market and housing construction. Now, I'm in dangerous territory in this room because you are really the experts. What on earth do I know about this? Not much. I can look at this from the high level, from the statistical and economic perspective, and I know your perspectives on it are going to be likely quite different. And that's why I hope at 11 o'clock you join me for the sort of the Q&A session where we can get into the weeds a little bit on this. But as an economist trying to find evidence of recovery, it might be easy to look at housing starts between March and July and say, well, this is compelling evidence, because in those 5 months, March to July, we did see housing starts at an annualized rate, and you guys understand what that is, back above 31,000 a month, well, annualized, but each of those 5 months, the pace was that in a year we build more than 30,000. Now, before the recession, of course, we were building at above 40,000 a year. Then it fell down to below 20 during the recession. Now it seems like it's bounced back up to above 30 and kind of some stability there. That, again, on the surface would lead maybe a sloppy or a lazy economist to say, well, there's good evidence that we're back in the groove and that things are humming along really nicely, a recovery. But I think there is something else going on here. From my perspective, and again, I'd love yours, but from my perspective, I think what we saw during the 2 years of recession, a lot of people sitting on the sidelines waiting to get into home ownership or waiting to build a home. By early 2017, finally feeling like, okay, the recession probably isn't going to get any worse. It's probably bottomed out. Prices aren't going to come down anymore. Now is probably the trigger point to get into the market and purchase that new home. As well, they probably thought in early 2017, it's not going to happen right away, but the Bank of Canada might start raising interest rates sometime later on in 2017. I'm going to lock in now. Prices aren't going to come down on that house. And I think what we saw in March to July is some potential sales, or those potential home buyers kind of brought forward it to the beginning of the year, to that March-July period. And what I'm anticipating is that the second half of 2017 and going into 2018, we might see some easing, some moderating in home starts. Not a collapse, not back down to 15,000 or 18,000 like we were in 2016, but pulling back from that 30,000 a year, probably more into the range of 25 to 27. So again, it could be a bit of an illusion that home starts were so relatively strong and consistent in that March to July period. I think what we've done is brought forward some of those housing starts and those sales, leaving the second half of the year probably to moderate a little bit. And that brings us to the Bank of Canada and what those rascals at the Bank of Canada have been up to. Now, usually the Bank of Canada, traditionally, previous governors, pardon me, you can sit and wonder what I'm going to say next while I have a drink of water. Oh, that's pure vodka. Someone left this here from last night. Well, now the presentation's really going to get good. Those rascals at the Bank of Canada, usually the Bank of Canada, they're not very likely to try to surprise markets or sort of wamboozle them with shocking announcements. It's been a long tradition of the Bank of Canada to, in fact, give a lot of, in the language of central banks, forward guidance. In other words, trying to signal to markets well in advance what they expect to do or what's going to happen with interest rates. Well, Stephen Poloz is a very different kind of governor. And I guess to his credit, his line is, look, I'm not trying to surprise anybody, but markets, you can read these indicators just as easily as we can. The Bank of Canada actually has no secret numbers that aren't privy to anybody else. So Stephen Poloz says, we will make the right call at the right time. We're not trying to surprise you. But if you see that Statistics Canada is showing that Canada is the fastest growing economy in the G7, that our unemployment rate nationally is now below where it started in that 2008 downturn, that inflation pressures and wage pressures are starting to creep up, you can conclude as easily as anyone at the Bank of Canada that it's time for a rate increase. And that is in fact what we saw in July, and they repeated again, of course, in early September. But even as late as May of 2017, the Bank of Canada, in its speeches and its press releases, they were kind of signaling, no, we're still worried about NAFTA negotiations, and we're worried about Toronto and Vancouver housing markets. There's all kinds of dark clouds. So the tone in May was rate increases aren't likely to come for quite a while. June 12, in a speech by one of the deputy governors, all of a sudden the tone changed very abruptly. In that speech, the message was rate increases are coming. Now is the time when the Canadian economy is showing that it's growing and we need to tap on the brake. And then by July, of course, the rate increase. But all of this happened in very, very quick, very short period of time. Surprisingly short, given the Bank of Canada traditionally likes to give lots of guidance and leeway. My guess is, going forward, I don't think we're going to see another rate increase in 2017, although who knows, the Bank of Canada has shown that it's happy to surprise us with certain things. Unless we were to see some very unusually strong growth indicators still coming up in Canada, a big surge, for example, in the Consumer Price Index, or a couple of months of very strong job growth, I think the Bank of Canada will be happy to sit on the sidelines, wait and see how the economy absorbs the 2 rate increases that they've just given us. But in 2018, I do think that they will continue their path of tightening, trying to get that overnight rate back to a neutral rate. Right now it's at 1%. The Bank of Canada would probably consider a neutral rate around 2.5% for that overnight rate. So they still have a long way to go, but I don't think they're going to be in too much of a hurry anymore this year. 2018, however, I would expect 2, maybe 3 rate increases, barring, of course, any spectacular kind of global financial crisis, or who knows what could happen. They'd always be ready to lower them again. But I think if things continue to grow at the pace they are, I think we'll see 2 or likely 3 rate increases in 2018. All right, so just to wrap up, reality or illusion? Is what we're seeing in Alberta's economy actually a recovery, or is it just an illusion of a recovery? Well, that's a tricky question to answer, but I'm going to end on this quote. If there's a single lesson that life teaches us, it's that wishing doesn't make it so. Lev Grossman from the novel The Magicians and the TV show. I think a lot of you can relate to that. Just because we might want it as an economist, maybe certain politicians, just because they really want to believe that in fact the economy is recovering, doesn't necessarily mean the economy is recovering. Is it a recovery? I would actually, I don't want to say it's not a recovery. In fact, I have used that word, but I think a better word to use is evolve. A recovery, by its definition, suggests that you're getting back to where you were. We all think of when we're sick with the flu or a cold and we lay on the couch for a few days, but eventually your body recovers and you're back to where you were. That is a recovery. In 2008 and 2009, in that nasty recession that Alberta saw, by 2010, I would call that a recovery, because oil prices went back up to $75 a barrel. And in 2010, Alberta's economy basically picked up where it left off in August of 2008. In other words, it was a nasty downturn, but in that sense, we did recover. We went back to where we were. This time around, I'm not expecting that recovery. I don't think we are going back to what it looked like in early 2014. I don't think anyone now is expecting oil prices to go back to $80 or $100 a barrel anytime soon. And there is some general consensus now within even downtown Calgary that 45 to 50, we're just going to have to kind of make that work. Rather than recover, I think evolve is the proper word to describe Alberta's economy. And that is a positive word too. It is moving in the right direction. I mean, we looked at some of those economic indicators, and you have to be careful with some of them, but things are progressing. The economy is growing again. We're not going back to where we were. Rather, we are evolving into something that I think in a few years will be a healthier, balanced, more diversified economy. And if oil stays between $45 and $50 and the energy patch continues to strive to make that price range work, it will allow other sectors to expand, to find that talent, to find those workers, office space, the industrial park space, all of those things that 3 years ago were really difficult for them to do. And I think we will see more diversity. And then finally, 2.5 is the new 4.5. Between 2010 and 2014, this province was growing at above 4% a year. 2013, in fact, we topped 5.5% real GDP growth rate. I mean, that's getting close to Chinese levels of growth. Not sustainable. You could argue it's not even healthy to have an economy this small and a mature economy growing that quickly. It creates all sorts of imbalances, and then we saw the fruits of those imbalances in 2015. 2.5 is the new 4.5. I think going forward, Alberta can anticipate a more moderate, consistent rate of growth, probably closer in line, in fact, to other Canadian provinces, and probably something that will be more sustainable in the long run. Our forecast at ATB Financial, and I always like to joke, the secret to good forecasting, revise frequently. And we have done this every quarter. In fact, my team sits down and we have a look at our forecast, and we usually make a few tweaks, sometimes more significant than others. But our most recent forecast is now calling for Alberta's real GDP growth 3.2% in 2017. Now that sounds actually pretty strong, and in fact, we might even be the fastest growing Canadian province this year. And that will seem counterintuitive to a lot of people in Alberta who are struggling to find work, who are not feeling optimistic about anything in the economy, even now. It might feel a bit oxymoronic, I guess, to say that Alberta was the fastest growing province when it doesn't feel like it. But we have to remember, we've just come out of 2 years of contraction where our economy shrunk by 7.5%. That is a really big hole, and the bar has been lowered. It doesn't really take that much growth to get a 3.2% sort of bounce back. But remember, even with 3.2% growth, we haven't even dug ourselves halfway out of the hole that was created over the recession. Our economy is really only back to the size it was at the end of 2012. So yeah, we are expecting a pretty good pace of growth, but it's not going to feel like it. 2018, 2019, we think that growth will moderate as the effects of the modest rebound in oil prices, that kind of goes away, expecting oil to stay around $50. We're expecting growth in 2018 and 2019 of 2.0 and 2.1%. I always joke at Economist, we think we can predict growth in the economy to 1/10 of a percentage point, but we do it all the time. So growth this year, moderating next year and in 2019. The unemployment rate, we think, will remain a big challenge, and that is where Albertans are going to still feel like the economy is quite sluggish. Our expectation is that the unemployment rate in 2017 will average 7.9%. Higher, of course, in the two major cities, and lower in rural Alberta. It is coming down gradually, but I think it will continue to be a gradual improvement in job creation and that unemployment rate drifting down slowly. And even by 2018, I think our forecast is 7%. So still too high. It is going to be a slog for a while as Alberta's economy evolves into something new. We have to be patient with it. But the good news is it is moving in the right direction. We are evolving, even if we're not going back to where we were in 2014. With that, I will conclude. I want to let you know, I think this audience knows about the owl. If you don't, I'll let you know very quickly. This is our daily comment that I write every morning along with my other economist in Edmonton, Nick. He and I write the owl. We used to call it the Daily Economic Comment. And I thought at one point, that is the dullest name possible. Who would sign up to something that boring? I mean, I probably would have, but I would hope actually other humans would not sign up for something that dull. We wanted to freshen it up and give it a little more character. We call it the owl, in fact. Does anyone know the significance of the great horned owl to this province? Someone always knows. We learned this in grade 4. It is our provincial bird. The great horned owl is Alberta's majestic official bird. Owls, if you know anything about them, and I assume you do, are very aware of what's going on around them. Nothing gets past an owl, although one got caught in a soccer field or a soccer net in Airdrie the other day, but it lived to live another day. But owls very aware of what's going on around them, so we thought it was a good title for the newsletter, which is subtitled Focused on Alberta's Economy. Every morning it's a 60-second read. That's all it takes. It's one new indicator that's hot off the press that day, or a very recent indicator. And we think if you subscribe to it and even just have a peek at the graph or a quick read, 60 seconds, it gives you a good real-time read, sort of an intravenous drip actually, of what's going on in Alberta's economy in the current, like right up to the moment. So if you want to subscribe, it is entirely free. You go to atb.com/economics. Tell your friends and neighbors about it. I'm trying to boost the subscriptions, especially because it's free. We think it's something that a lot of Albertans might find useful. And then the very final thing I want to mention is another animal, and that is spiders. In April of this year, I released my third book called Spiders in Space, Successfully Adapting to Unwanted Change. Now, the title, Spiders in Space, you might find a little curious. What do spiders have to do with the economy or change? The title draws from an experiment that NASA scientists were conducting back in 2011. And they had done the experiment a few other times in the past, but in 2011 they brought some spiders up to the International Space Station. They wanted to observe what will spiders do in zero gravity, especially around building their web. Will the spiders even attempt to build web? Will they be able to build web in zero gravity? Because if you think about the way a spider builds its web on Earth, and we've all watched this, the spider lowers itself down. It uses its body's weight and gravity in the construction process. The whole tension of the web is held in place with gravity. That's why they're always vertical and never horizontal. So what will happen without gravity? Well, according to the research, the spiders, they crawled out of the little tubes up in the International Space Station. Their DNA tells them, if you're hungry, you've got to spin some web and trap some food. And yes, the astronauts, they did bring some flies up with them. That's usually the question that I get. But the spiders got busy right away attempting to build web, but it was not working out well at all. The spiders were confused, they were floating around, they didn't know what was going on. They were lethargic. Their first attempts at building web were described as messy and disorganized. They were not workable or usable webs, wouldn't be able to catch anything. So it was not looking good for the spiders, but then quite soon on, something astounding happened. And that is, the spiders developed totally new structures of web building, new techniques. Rather than lowering themselves down, which wasn't working, they started in a corner and using a thinner strand of web and different structures of web, they started going back and forth, kind of like a little windshield wiper action, and building it from the corner out. A workable web in zero gravity. Now, if you think about how amazing that is, nowhere in the collective conscience of spiders was there some sort of recipe for how to build a web in zero gravity. This wasn't passed on from the generations. You know, and not once in the 100 million year history of spiders on Earth. They've always had gravity and it's always worked perfectly until that moment where everything changed and the spiders were able to adapt. Now, I love this story for a lot of reasons. I think already you can understand the lessons it teaches. But I always joke, if the spiders were humans, the first things the spiders would have done is form a committee, right? This is just what we do. They would have said, we've got a big problem, we need a committee. The committee is going to meet with some experts and they're going to discuss this. They're going to present a white paper with a solution. And no doubt that solution or that white paper would have concluded the only way out of this is we need those astronauts to get us back to Earth. Because we knew how to operate on Earth. We need to get back to where we were. And that is the human impulse. That is our human nature when faced with a crisis or a calamity or some sort of problem. That our human nature just says we need to get back to where we were. Spiders, they don't really overthink it. Well, we don't actually know what went through the spiders' heads, but they didn't form a committee. They didn't say, well, you need to get back to Earth. They said, well, we've got a very different environment, but fundamentally we're still spiders and we spin web. We just need to figure out how do we do this in this very new and challenging environment. So in that spirit, my co-author and I, Rob Roach, who works with me at ATB, we wrote this book. We profiled 15 successful adapters in Canada. Some of them are individuals, some of them are businesses, some of them are not-for-profits. Coast to coast, all 15 of them face a similar story in that they were blindsided by something they did not see coming at all. Something that didn't just require a few tweaks, but fundamentally changed their lives, the way their business operated, the way their industry operated. And fundamentally, these changes were not positive. I mean, sometimes unexpected change can be good, but these were decidedly not positive changes at all. But the remarkable thing about these 15 successful adapters is that they were able to not just thrive or survive the change, they were in fact able to pivot, adapt, and thrive in their new environment. It wasn't just a matter of hunkering down and getting through it and then going back to where you were, because in not one of the 15 profile cases was going back to where we were. That was never an option for them. So we profile these 15 what we think are inspiring stories, and then the second half of the book we try to determine what are the common characteristics or the traits of these 15 adapters, and how can those traits maybe help inform all of us what it's going to take to adapt to sudden change. Because if there's one thing that we can all be certain of, if it's in our personal life or our physical lives, our business lives, at some point we are going to be faced with a phone call, we are going to be faced with some sort of change that we are not happy about at all. How can we not just survive, but in fact thrive in that new environment? So for those of you who are, I think we're not going to do Q&A right now, is that correct? Where's Laura? We are not. There she is. We're not, yeah. So we're not going to do any Q&A now. However, the good news is, at 11 o'clock to 12, I'm going to be downstairs in a session, and then we're going to turn it open to you. We're going to get into some discussion about what the economy is doing. I would love to hear some of your perspectives as builders and in the residential market, especially around what's going on. We're going to, everyone who comes to that session is going to get a free book. It's fantastic news. So thank you to BILD Alberta for that. And we can talk about some of the themes in the book as well. If you're not able to come to the 11 o'clock session, I'm going to be selling some books. I'm going to stick around all morning. But with that, I want to thank you very much for your kind attention. I want to thank you for inviting me back, and I wish you a great day on the links and a wonderful rest of 2017. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Todd.